On the morning of January the 9th, 1887, the temperature in Fergus County, Montana Territory dropped to 46 degrees below zero. The wind came from the north with a sound like tearing metal, driving snow so dense and so hard that a man standing 10 feet from his own door could not find it. Across the open range, cattle that had survived 11 Montana winters died, where they stood, their legs locking in the cold, their bodies crusting with ice until they became white shapes indistinguishable from the drifts around them. The open range cattle industry, the great empire of beef that had dominated Montana for 2 decades, was dying in a single night. 1,400 animals belonging to one man alone would be dead before the storm lifted. Across the territory, the final count would reach 362,000 head. The cowboys who had mocked sheep operations as the work of women and fools would board eastbound trains in the spring with nothing but the clothes they wore. But on a small claim along a seasonal creek feeding the Musselshell River, in a structure that looked like nothing anyone in Montana had ever seen or imagined, a 63-year-old Norwegian widow and her 8-year-old granddaughter were warm. The thermometer inside read 62 degrees Fahrenheit. The walls were soft to the touch, round, covered in felt made from the wool of sheep that were themselves surviving the storm in a willow windbreak 40 yards away. This is the story of how that structure came to exist and what it cost to build it. Astrid Vollen arrived at her son's homestead claim in Fergus County on the 3rd of May, 1886. She arrived 3 weeks after burying him in Miles City. Typhoid fever had taken Erickson in 11 days, the same swift and indifferent arithmetic that the frontier applied to everyone who arrived on it with plans. She was 62 years old, small-framed in the way of Norwegian women who have spent their lives working rather than resting, with hands that showed every decade of that work in their texture and their strength. She had crossed an ocean at 34 with her husband, buried her husband at 51, buried her son at 62, and she was still standing because standing was what she did when the alternative presented itself. She had with her one granddaughter, Marin, 7 years old, yellow-haired, with her father's jaw set in her mother's face. Marin's mother had died of the same fever 2 days after Erickson, which was the kind of thing that happened and which Astrid could not afford to spend time understanding because Marin was alive and needed feeding, and that was the task in front of her. She had $14 sewn into the hem of her dress. She had 180 sheep grazing the creek bottom. She had a draft horse that was old, but sound, and she had whatever Erickson had managed to build before he got sick. What Erickson had managed to build was 4 rounds of cottonwood logs, roughly 16 by 20 feet, stacked and notched to a height of 4 feet from the ground. He had laid the foundation. He had planned a cabin raising for August, when neighbors would come, and men would lift the heavy logs into place, and by September they would have a roof and walls and a fighting chance against what the Musselshell Valley could produce between October and April. But there were no neighbors, not for sheep people, not in cattle country, and Erickson was dead. Astrid walked the perimeter of the 4-foot walls on her first morning. She put her hand on each round of cottonwood and felt the work her son had put into it, the notching precise, the stacking tight, the foundation solid as anything she had seen built by men twice his age. He had been good with his hands, her Erickson. Better than his father, which was saying something. She counted the logs still cut and waiting. She counted what remained in the timber stand along the creek. She did the arithmetic that would keep her awake for the next 3 weeks. To finish the cabin required 60 additional cottonwood logs, each 18 to 24 feet long and too heavy for one person to lift above shoulder height. Raising wall logs required either a block and tackle system she did not own and could not afford, a team of horses she did not have, or the neighbors who would not come. She needed 8 cords of firewood split and stacked before the first hard freeze, which came to this valley sometime in late October. She needed a roof. She needed chinking. She needed a stove. A cast iron stove cost $18 in Lewistown, 42 miles away, by wagon road. She had 14. She stood at the 4-foot walls in the May morning and looked at the problem the way she had looked at every problem in 62 years of living, which was directly and without softening, because softening a problem did not change its dimensions, and she had never had the luxury of pretending otherwise. Then she went to make breakfast for Marin and start the day's work, because there was always a day's work and it always needed starting. Halvard Cross came from the south on the 6th day. He was 61 years old, Norwegian, like Astrid's family, running a small cattle operation 15 miles down the valley. He had heard about Erickson's death from a passing freighter, and he had ridden up not to help, but to tell the truth as he understood it, because he was a man who believed that the kindest thing you could do for someone in a dangerous situation was make sure they understood the danger completely. He dismounted slowly the way men dismount when their joints have been rearranged by too many winters on horseback. He walked to the 4-foot walls and stood with his hands on his hips, studying them the way Astrid had studied them, counting logs and calculating angles, and doing the same arithmetic she had already done. He had a face that weather had worked on for decades, deep lines running from his nose to the corners of his mouth, eyes that were pale blue and direct, and that had seen things he did not talk about, but that had permanently altered the way he looked at the world. In 1875, a blizzard had caught him and his first wife in a half-finished dugout on a claim 30 miles north of here. The walls had not been thick enough. The firewood had run out on the third day. His wife Sigrid had died holding their infant daughter. The infant daughter had died at 6 hours later. Halvard Cross had survived by burning everything he owned that would burn, including the frame of the wagon they had arrived in, and he had emerged from that winter into a spring that meant nothing to him for about 3 years afterward. He did not tell Astrid any of this. He told her the conclusion. A woman alone cannot cut 60-foot logs or raise wall timbers without help, he said. He said it without cruelty, standing at her son's unfinished walls with his hat in his hands. You will freeze, and that girl will freeze beside you. I have seen this before. He looked at Marin, who was playing near the canvas tent that served as their current shelter, dragging a stick through the dirt in some private game. 7 years old, yellow hair catching the morning light, small enough that a hard January would take her first. The girl looks like someone I knew, Cross said. He said it quietly, more to himself than to Astrid. Then he put his hat back on and mounted his horse and rode south without looking back. Astrid watched him go. She did not argue with him because he was not wrong and she knew it. She did not feel despair because despair required time she did not have. She went back to the canvas tent and looked at Marin playing in the dirt, and she sat down on the ground and looked at the 4-foot walls in the unfinished cabin that her son had died before he could finish, and she thought about what was available to her and what was not. That night, she made a list. $14. 1 draft horse old but capable of pulling loads. 180 sheep. 400 pounds of raw wool from the spring shearing stored under canvas. Miles of willow growing along the creek. 4 months until the first killing freeze. No wagon. Erickson had sold theirs to pay the land filing fee. No stove. No neighbors who would help with the logs. No money to hire anyone. No family east that she could reach, and no family east that would take her in even if she could. 3 options, she wrote. Not in words. She was not a woman who wrote things in words when numbers would serve. She laid them out the way her father had taught her to lay out problems, as a column of facts with a column of consequences beside each one. Option 1, abandon the claim. Return to Miles City. Find work as a domestic servant while Marin grew up without land, without the future Erickson had died trying to build. Option 2, stay in the canvas tent through winter. Die. Marin would likely be taken in by someone. This option had the advantage of being simple. Option 3, find a way that did not currently exist. She folded the paper and put it in her dress pocket and went to sleep. In the morning, she began looking for option 3. She found it in June on a day when she was doing one of the tasks that actually had a clear path forward, which was washing the spring shearing wool in the creek. 400 pounds of raw fleece needed washing before it could be sold or used. She had been working through the pile slowly, a few pounds at a time, beating the fleece against rocks to knock loose the worst of the debris, soaking it in the cold creek water until the lanolin softened and the dirt floated free. Her mother had taught her this work in Norway when she was Marin's age. Wool processing was a woman's knowledge passed hand to hand through generations, so ordinary and so constant that you stop seeing it the way you stop seeing the walls of a room you live in. On this particular afternoon, a wind came down from the Judith Mountains without warning, carrying the cold edge of something that should not have been in the air in June, and Astrid shivered in her thin dress and without thinking wrapped a raw fleece around her shoulders. The fleece was still damp from washing. She expected clammy cold against her skin. She had wrapped wet cloth around herself in bad weather before and knew exactly what it felt like, the way moisture conducted the cold straight through. What she felt instead was warmth. Not just warmth. Warmth that made no physical sense given the dampness. A gentle, sustained heat, as if the wool itself were doing something active, something intentional, holding and generating in a way that wet material had no business doing. She stood at the edge of the creek with the damp fleece around her shoulders and the cold wind on her face, and something shifted in her mind. Some door opening onto a room she had passed 1,000 times without entering. Her mother's voice came to her across 30 years in an ocean and the accumulation of everything that had happened in between. Wool holds heat even when wet. That is why lambs survive in spring rain that kills calves. Astrid had heard her mother say those words so many times they had become part of the background of her childhood, as unremarkable as the sound of the loom or the smell of the kitchen. She had heard them without listening, the way you hear things that are too familiar to register. She stood in the June wind with the wet fleece warm around her, and she listened to them for the first time. The secret was the structure. Not the fiber itself, not the warmth of the animal that had grown it, but the architecture of what wool was at the microscopic level. Millions of tiny crimped fibers trapping air in the spaces between them. Dead air, still air. The warmest substance in nature, because still air conducts almost no heat away from a body, and moving air conducts it away very fast, and wool's job was to hold the air motionless against the skin, regardless of what the air outside was doing. Even when wet, even when crusted with ice on the outside, the inner layer stayed dry. The lambs stayed warm. That was why. Astrid stood by the creek for a long time. Then she picked up another fleece and kept washing. But she was thinking. She was thinking in the particular way she thought when a solution was assembling itself from components she had not yet fully identified, the way her father had taught her to let a problem move through her rather than attacking it directly. Let it come together. Don't force it. Trust that the components will find each other if you hold them loosely enough. It came together that night. She lay in the canvas tent with Marin asleep against her side, listening to the tent fabric snap in the wind, feeling the cold seep through the seams the way it always did. And she thought about the wool and the still air and the lambs that survived what killed the calves. She thought about felt. Her mother had made felt. Not the thin commercial felt of boot liners and saddle pads, but the thick, dense pressed felt that came from raw wool, properly worked layer over layer, hot water and friction, in time transforming loose fiber into something almost like leather, strong enough to stand alone, dense enough to stop wind, thick enough in sufficient layers to hold heat. What if she covered a shelter in felt? She laughed in the dark, not from amusement, from the recognition of how absurd the idea sounded when she formed it in words. No one built a house from wool. Felt was for small things, for things that fit between your hands. Covering an entire structure in felt was not how any person anywhere had ever thought about the problem of staying warm. But she kept thinking. A felt covering needed a frame. She could not build log walls. She had known that from the first day. But she could build something lighter. Willow saplings bent and tied the way shepherds in Norway made windbreaks for newborn lambs in late winter storms. She had watched her grandfather build those. She had built small versions herself as a girl. If she made the shelter round instead of square, the wind could not push against flat walls. It would flow around the curve the way water flowed around a stone in the creek, finding no surface to press against, no corner to exploit. If she made it small, just large enough for 2 people and a stove, she would need less material and less fuel to heat it. Small volume, more efficient. Every fire she had ever tended had worked harder in a larger room and easier in a smaller one. She had wool. 400 pounds of it sitting under canvas with no way to get it 42 miles to market in Lewistown without a wagon she did not own. She had willow miles of it growing in stands along the creek that she passed every day. She had her mother's knowledge of how felt was made carried in her hands from a different country and a different life. She had time. 4 months until the first freeze. She had nothing else. But she had these things. And for the first time since she had stood at her son's 4-foot walls and done the arithmetic of impossibility, she had something that might be option 3. Declan Marr arrived in late July. He was 54 years old and he owned the largest cattle operation in the Musselshell Valley. Nearly 3,000 head on range he controlled through the accumulated weight of money and reputation and the implied threat of men who worked for him and who had particular skills in making problems disappear. He had been pushing sheep operations out of Fergus County since 1882. Two shepherds had already abandoned their claims rather than face his night riders. Erickson Vollen had filed on land that Marr considered his by right of prior use, and the spring that fed Astrid's Creek also fed one of Marr's watering points downstream. He came with two men, and he did not bother dismounting. He expressed sorrow about her son's death in a tone that expressed nothing of the kind. He observed that a woman alone on open range was not safe, that things happened to sheep that couldn't always be explained, that coyotes and disease and the general unpredictability of frontier life were hard on small operations without the resources to absorb setbacks. Then he reached into his vest pocket and produced a coin purse. $5 a head for the sheep, he said. He said it the way a man says something he has already decided is final. 180 sheep at $5 apiece was $900, which was twice what the animals were worth at fair market, and both of them knew what the excess represented. "The sheep are not for sale," Astrid said. She said it the same way she said everything, without volume and without qualification. She was standing near the willow pile she had been cutting when he arrived, and she had not put down the axe, not as a threat, but because setting down a tool in the middle of work was a thing she did not do. Marr looked at the pile of willow saplings. He looked at the canvas tent. He looked at the 4-foot walls of the unfinished cabin and the raw material stacked around the work area that was beginning to look like nothing recognizable to him. He shook his head the way men shake their heads at things they consider beneath engagement. "Winter's going to sort this out before I have to bother," he said. He put the coin purse back in his vest and gathered his reins and rode north toward his range and his 3,000 cattle, his men following. Astrid watched them until they crested the ridge and dropped from sight. Then she picked up her axe and went back to cutting willow. She needed 72 saplings for the lattice walls. She had 61. Cecily Drummond rode over from her cattle claim 7 miles east in early July to check on what she called the Norwegian widow. Cecily was 45, practical in the way of women who have managed alone since their husbands died, and who have organized their thinking around what works and what does not work, because the margin for what does not work is very thin. She found Astrid cutting willow and stopped her horse and looked at the piles of stripped saplings and the canvas spread out on the ground with the beginnings of a lattice pattern taking shape on it, and she waited for the explanation that would make this make sense. Astrid explained it. The round frame, the felt covering, the trapped air insulation, the small volume that would be easier to heat than a log cabin. She explained it the way she thought about it, as a sequence of physical principles rather than a novel idea, because that was what it was. Cecily listened with the furrowed expression of a woman running calculations she was not sure she liked the result of. "You want to build a tent," she said, "out of sheep hair, felt, pressed wool. It holds heat. I know what felt is. I have felt boot liners. They are 1/2 inch thick. You are talking about covering an entire house. Small house. Round. The wind won't tear at it the way it tears at flat walls." Cecily dismounted. She picked up one of the willow saplings and flexed it between her hands, testing the give. She walked to where the lattice was beginning to take shape on the canvas and looked at the pattern of it, the crossed laths and the rawhide bindings Astrid planned for the joints. "When the felt gets wet," she said, "when the weight of snow crushes the frame, when the first real cold comes and you discover that soft walls can't hold heat the way logs do." Astrid had thought about all of these things. She did not have complete answers to all of them. She said so. Cecily looked at her for a long moment. "I am telling you this because someone should have told me things before Clayton died," she said. Her voice was not unkind. It was the voice of someone who had learned expensive lessons and believed in sharing them. "You don't have time to test ideas that fail. If this fails, there is no backup, nothing." "I know. Build a sod house. Cut the prairie with your axe. That is what survives out here." Astrid looked at the 4-foot cabin walls her son had notched with his careful hands before he died. "The sod would need to be cut with a breaking plow," she said. "I don't have a plow. I don't have a team to pull one. I have willow, and I have wool, and I have 4 months. This is what I have." Cecily mounted her horse. She sat there a moment looking down at Astrid, at this 62-year-old woman standing in the July sun with calloused hands and an axe and a pile of willow saplings and a plan that made no engineering sense. "I'll check on you in a month," she said. "I hope you've come to your senses by then." She rode east toward her claim, toward her 30 cattle, toward the life that made sense to people who understood what was possible in Montana. Astrid watched her go. Then she went back to cutting saplings. She needed 11 more. The framework began in August, 14-hour days. Astrid worked while Marin played nearby, gathering small sticks for kindling, asking questions about what her grandmother was building, accepting the answers with the matter-of-fact trust of a child who has decided that the adult in her life knows what she is doing. Baoi, Marin said one afternoon, using the Norwegian word she had learned for grandmother before she learned to say it in English. "Will the house really be warm?" Astrid said. "Really warm, like inside a barn warm." "Warmer than a barn," Astrid said. She did not know if that was true, but she said it the way she had said difficult, true things to Marin since Miles City, with the particular steadiness of a person who understands that a child's confidence in the future is a resource that must be carefully managed. The lattice walls required 72 willow laths, each 6 feet long and 1 inch thick. Every lath needed holes bored at 9-inch intervals to accept the rawhide crossings that would bind them in a crisscross pattern. That was 576 holes. She heated an iron rod in her campfire until it glowed orange, then burned through each lath. Hold the rod, press, count to 10, pull back, move to the next mark, reheat. 576 holes, one at a time. The holes took 2 weeks. The weaving took another week. She stretched the laths on the ground in an overlapping X pattern, threading wet rawhide through corresponding holes. The rawhide would shrink as it dried, tightening each joint to the point where the lattice became a single flexible panel that could be expanded like an accordion and pulled into a circular wall. The crown ring was the hardest part of the frame. She needed a circle of wood roughly 55 inches across that could accept 48 roof poles at angles that would carry the load of the felt covering and whatever snow accumulated above it. She had no steam box for bending lumber. She had no experience with the technique. She had no time to develop it through trial and error. She found 4 sections of cottonwood branch that had grown with a natural arc, each about 15 inches of usable curve. She laid them end to end in a rough circle and lashed the joints with wet rawhide, the same shrinkage principle as the lattice. The result was not elegant. The circle was not perfectly round. But when the rawhide dried and tightened, the ring held. She notched the inner edge to accept 48 roof poles, and it held those too. By the 1st of September, the frame was ready. 48 aspen poles radiating down from the crown ring like wheel spokes, their lower ends resting on top of the lattice walls. Everything lashed with rawhide, the whole structure rising 15 feet across at the base and 8 feet at the center. It looked impossibly fragile. It looked like something a strong wind would end in 30 seconds. It looked like nothing she had ever seen built by anyone anywhere. It was standing. Then September brought the rain. An unseasonable storm swept through the valley on the 15th, overnight, harder and longer than any September storm she had seen in her 3 months in Montana. She had 2 felt panels drying on wooden racks nearly finished, needing 1 more day in the sun to complete the compression that would give them their final density. She had covered them with canvas and weighted the corners. The wind tore the canvas loose before midnight. She found the panels at dawn soaked through and sagging, the fibers beginning to separate in the way that wet felt separates when the compression is interrupted before it sets. Wet felt that is not dried properly will not recover. The fibers loosen. The panel loses its integrity. It becomes something that looks like felt and is not. 3 days. She lost 3 days repairing them, stretching them tight on frames, turning them every hour to catch the weak September sun, working with a focus that she did not allow to become panic, because panic consumed energy she did not have. 3 days she had not planned for in a schedule that had already been counted to the hour. That night, she sat outside the canvas tent in the dark after Marin was asleep, and for the first time since May, she did not immediately begin calculating what came next. She sat with the $6 remaining in her dress hem and the 3 weeks until the first expected freeze and the 2 repaired panels drying on their frames and the 9 more panels still to be made, and she sat with all of it without moving. Halvard Cross had said she would freeze. He had said the girl would freeze beside her. He had stood at the 4-foot walls and done the arithmetic and arrived at the same answer she herself had arrived at before option 3 had presented itself. She looked at Marin sleeping in the tent, the child's face peaceful and entirely trusting in the way of children who do not yet know how much depends on the person they trust. She thought about what Cross had said in May before he rode away. The girl looks like someone I knew. The quiet way he had said it, not as an explanation, but as a thing that had surfaced from somewhere he usually kept closed. She knew what he had lost in 1875. It was the kind of story that moved through communities like the one she had come from, passed between women in particular, as a warning and as a grief held collectively. A wife and an infant daughter in a half-finished shelter when the wood ran out. Marin would not be that story. She would not let Marin be the child in that story. Astrid stood up from the ground at 3 in the morning and went to the drying frames and began the work that was waiting for her. Not because she was brave, not because she was certain, because the alternative had a face she recognized, a 7-year-old face with yellow hair and her father's jaw, and that face was not acceptable. She worked until dawn. By the 5th of October, the felt panels were ready. 11 panels, 7 for the walls, 4 for the roof. Each one the product of 5 to 6 days of work from raw wool to finished felt. 3 to 4 hours of dragging the rolled mat behind the draft horse across the roughest ground she could find. Unroll. Re-wet with hot soapy water heated over the fire. Roll again. 3 more hours. Unroll. Flip. Roll from the other direction. Repeat until the fibers had locked together into something dense and stiff that bore only a memory of resemblance to the loose fleece it had started as. She had used approximately 300 pounds of raw wool to make them. Each panel weighed nearly 40 pounds finished. The total covering for the structure weighed more than 400 pounds. She assembled it in a single day starting before dawn. The wall panels first. She wrapped them around the lattice frame and tied them with wool cord, climbing the makeshift ladder she had lashed together from cottonwood branches, pulling the heavy felt over the frame section by section, adjusting, tying, climbing down, and repositioning the ladder, climbing again. By evening, the walls were covered. The roof panels went up the next day, overlapping like shingles, so water would drain outward and down. She tied them to the roof poles, to the crown ring, to the upper edges of the wall panels below. The crown ring at the center stayed open, a smoke hole 12 inches across that would serve the stove she did not yet have. On the 5th of October, 1886, she sat and looked at what she had built. It was round 15 feet across, 8 feet high at the center. The walls were soft to the touch, but dense, nearly 1.5 inches of compressed wool fiber over a lattice of willow laths bound with rawhide. The color was creamy white, not yet weathered. It looked like nothing on the Montana prairie. It looked like nothing anywhere that she knew of, built from materials she had been standing in the middle of since May, without knowing they were the answer. She stood there for a long time. Then she went inside and sat in the center of the floor in the dark, in the quiet, and she thought about her mother, who had taught her to wash wool in a Norwegian creek and to press fiber into felt on a stone floor with her small hands, who had said 10,000 times that wool holds heat even when wet, who had been dead for 30 years, and who had just across all of that distance helped her granddaughter build a house in Montana. Marin crawled through the felt door flap and sat beside her in the dark. "It doesn't have a fire yet," Marin said. "Not yet, but it will be warm." Astrid put her arm around the child. "Yes," she said, "it will be warm." She said it this time without qualification and without the private uncertainty that had qualified it before. She pressed her palm against the wall beside her and held it there, feeling the give and the density of the compressed wool under her hand, the structure of it, the millions of crimped fibers holding still air against her skin. The first freeze was 15 days away. She had built the thing that could not be built. Now she had to find out if it worked. The first freeze came on October the 20th. Astrid woke at 4 in the morning to breathe. She could see in the dark white vapor rising from her mouth in the lamplight, and she felt the particular quality of cold that is different from cool, the way a stopped clock is different from a slow one. Not a gradation, a threshold crossed. She scrambled out of the blankets and fed Thorson's stove the battered cast iron that Halvard Cross had left without explanation 2 weeks earlier, and she crouched in front of it with her hands extended and waited. The interior of the wool house was cold. Colder than she had expected for a space that had been sealed for 2 weeks. The thermometer she had hung on an inside post read 35 degrees Fahrenheit, and the panic that she had been managing since May, keeping it at arm's length through the discipline of work and calculation, moved closer than it had ever come. She fed the stove carefully, not too much at once. She had watched fires for 62 years, and she knew that a cold stove fed too fast produced smoke before it produced heat, and smoke in an enclosed space with one smoke hole the size of a dinner plate was a problem she could not afford. The fire caught. It built. She watched the thermometer. It moved. Not the way temperature moved in a log cabin, slow and leaking, climbing a degree at a time while the walls conducted cold back from outside as fast as the fire could push heat inward. It moved the way it moved in a small space with no drafts and walls that were doing what wool did, holding the warmth close instead of trading it away. 40 degrees, 45, 50. Within an hour, 52 degrees Fahrenheit inside the wool house. Outside, the thermometer nailed to the willow windbreak post read 22 degrees. By dawn, it was 60 degrees inside. Astrid sat in the center of the floor with her back against the stove's warmth and her hands in her lap, and she pressed her palm flat against the felt wall beside her, and she felt what she had suspected and hoped and been afraid to rely on. The wall was not cold, it was not warm exactly. It was something in between the temperature of a thing that is refusing to give up what it holds, that is doing the quiet work of insulation. The way wool had always done it, fiber by fiber, air pocket by air pocket, the accumulated small decisions of physics adding up to something that kept a woman and a child alive on the Montana prairie. She laughed, not from joy, not exactly, from the relief of a person who has built something on a foundation of reasoning and memory and desperate hope, and has just learned that the reasoning was sound. Marin woke at the sound and looked at her grandmother laughing in the early light of the first frozen morning and said, "Is it working?" "Yes," Astrid said, "it is working." Through late October, she learned the wool house, the way you learn any living system, by paying attention to it across all its conditions and watching how it responded to what she gave it and what the world outside demanded. The stove needed feeding every 3 to 4 hours in moderate cold, which she defined as 0 to 20 below. A full load of split cottonwood burned clean and hot for 4 hours and left enough coals that the next load caught quickly. She woke twice in the night to feed it and returned to sleep with the automatic ease of a person who has trained herself to a rhythm. The interior temperature stabilized between 60 and 68 degrees with regular stoking. She tracked it on the thermometer morning and evening, and in the middle of the night when she rose for the fire building, a record of the wool house's behavior across temperatures and wind conditions that became a kind of knowledge she could not have gotten any other way. The felt walls breathed. This surprised her, and then when she thought about it, did not surprise her at all. Moisture from cooking and breathing, and the simple biological fact of two people living in an enclosed space did not condense and drip the way it had in the canvas tent. The wool absorbed it, held it, released it slowly through the outer layers, managing the humidity, the way the fiber managed temperature, with a patience and a thoroughness that no manufactured material she had ever encountered could match. When the wind came, and in Montana the wind came often and without courtesy, she heard the roar of it against the outside of the wool house and felt nothing inside. The round walls gave the wind nothing to press against, no flat surface to load with lateral force, no corner to pry at. The wind found the curve and went around it the way water went around a stone, and what arrived on the other side was diminished and indifferent, and inside was still. She hung a second thermometer outside and began comparing the readings with the interior readings, keeping the numbers in a small notebook she had bought in Lewistown in August. The differential grew as the season deepened. 20 degrees outside, 62 inside, 12 below outside, 58 inside. She was beginning to understand the shape of what she had built, not just as a shelter, but as a system with consistent and predictable behavior. Marin learned the rhythms alongside her. The child knew when the stove needed feeding before the thermometer dropped enough to require it, some combination of the sound of the fire and the feel of the air on her face that she had developed without instruction. She brought wood from the stack inside the door with the focused competence of a child given real responsibility, and she carried it with 2 hands and loaded the stove with a care that was more adult than most adults managed. One evening, Astrid watched her granddaughter load the stove and thought about her mother in Norway doing the same thing with the kitchen fire, small hands, careful with the iron handle, the same gesture across 2 generations and an ocean and everything in between. She did not let herself think about it for too long. There was always work. Cecily Drummond came in early November. She dismounted outside the wool house and stood looking at it the way she had stood looking at the pile of willow saplings in July, with the expression of a woman running calculations and not yet having arrived at the answer. The felt had weathered in the weeks since assembly, taking on a slightly grayer cast, the outer fibers compressing further under wind and light rain until the surface had the look of something that had decided to be permanent. She knocked on the door frame, the cottonwood post that formed one side of the entrance, and Astrid opened the felt flap. The warmth came out first before Cecily could see anything inside. A wall of 60-degree air meeting the November cold of the Montana morning, and Cecily's expression changed in the fraction of a second before she could reassemble it. "It's still standing," she said. "Yes. Can I come in?" Astrid held the flap open. Cecily stepped inside and stood in the center of the space, letting her eyes adjust to the dimness. She looked at the stove, the neat arrangement of the sleeping pallets, the organized supplies stacked against the curved wall. She held out her hands toward the warmth and turned them palm up, feeling the radiant heat from the iron box, feeling what the space held around it. "It's warmer than I expected," she said. "I know." Cecily walked to the inside post and read the thermometer. 61 degrees. She looked at the felt wall nearest her and pressed her palm against it, holding it there. The wall did not chill her hand. She stood in the wool house for several minutes without speaking. When she finally spoke, her voice had the particular quality of a careful person recalibrating. "This isn't winter yet," she said. "Wait until 40 below. Wait until the wind blows for 3 days without stopping." She was not being cruel. Astrid understood that. She was being the kind of honest that frontier life produced in people who had survived it long enough. The kind that did not soften assessment for the sake of comfort, because comfort costs lives. "I'll wait," Astrid said. November the 10th, the first real blizzard of the season. 8 inches of snow fell overnight. The temperature dropped to 12 below zero. Winds sustained at 25 miles per hour with gusts to 40, the kind of wind that found gaps in log cabin chinking and made fires work twice as hard as they should, and reminded everyone living on the mussel shell that the prairie made no promises and kept fewer. Astrid stayed awake all night, feeding the stove every 2 hours. Marin slept under 3 wool blankets, with the total unconsciousness of a child who trusts the adult on watch, and Astrid sat in the wool house and listened to the wind roar outside and felt nothing inside. The round walls flexed slightly in the strongest gusts, a subtle give that she had not felt before, and that alarmed her for the first 30 seconds, and then did not alarm her because she could feel that it was the flexibility of something well made rather than the yielding of something about to fail, the difference between a green branch bending in wind and a dry branch about to break. By morning, the interior temperature was 58 degrees. She stepped outside into the bitter cold and walked around the wool house, checking every panel, every lashing, every point where the felt met the ground. Snow had drifted against the base on the north and northwest sides, and she stood for a moment looking at those drifts, understanding that they were adding insulation, that the wind-driven snow was doing the wool house a kindness it did not need but would accept. Nothing had collapsed. Nothing had torn. Nothing had failed. She went back inside and made breakfast and fed the stove and added the night's numbers to her notebook. December brought rumors carried on freight wagons passing through the valley. The summer drought had been worse than anyone understood while it was happening. The grass had not recovered before the snow came. Cattle across the territory were going into winter thin and weak, their bodies without the reserves that a normal autumn grazing season would have built. Ranchers who had spent 2 decades on the open range were beginning to sell at any price, moving cattle before the full weight of what was coming could be measured. Declan Marr was among them. A rider who passed on the trail south of Astrid's claim reported that Marr had sold 300 head in November at prices that would have seemed absurd 8 months earlier. He still had 2,700 cattle on his range, but the grass under the snow was sparse and the snow was deep, and the cattle were burning reserves they did not have against a cold that had not yet shown what it intended. Astrid looked at her sheep. They were fat. The creek bottom grass had recovered after August rains, and her flock had grazed well into October, and sheep grazed differently from cattle, their lips able to reach forage closer to the ground, their instincts better suited to winter range management. They were in better condition than anything on 4 legs in the Mussel Shell Valley. She did not say this to anyone. She stacked firewood and did not say things. By her count, she had 6 cords split and stacked against the south side of the wool house, where the wall provided some windbreak for the pile. Less than the 8 cords she had wanted. But the wool house's efficiency had been running ahead of her conservative estimates since October, and she thought 6 cords might be enough if the winter ran at average length and average depth. She did not know that this winter had no intention of running at average anything. December the 31st, the last night of 1886. Astrid stood outside the wool house as the year ended. The temperature at 8 below zero, stars burning in the frozen sky with the particular hard brightness that extreme cold produces, as if the cold had polished them. She could see for miles in the clear night the snow-covered valley spreading in every direction, the dark shapes of the Judith Mountains to the north against the stars. Marin was asleep inside, warm. Astrid looked north toward the darkness where Mars' 3,000 cattle were trying to hold heat they did not have against a cold that was going to get worse before it considered getting better. She looked south toward where Halvard Cross's small cabin sat in the trees 15 miles away, the old Norwegian warming himself with 3 times the wood she used for the same result. She looked east toward Cecily Drummond's place, the woman who had told her soft walls couldn't hold heat like logs. She went back inside. She fed the stove and lay down and went to sleep. The morning of January the 9th, 1887 began normally. Astrid woke at 5, fed the stove, checked the thermometer. 8 below outside, 61 inside. She made coffee and ate dried venison and hard biscuit and planned to drag more deadfall from the creek bottom that day because her woodpile had been declining faster than her estimates since the temperature began its serious descent in late December. Marin woke at 7 and ate her breakfast and asked if she could come help drag wood, and Astrid said yes because 2 pairs of hands were always better than 1, even when 1 pair was 8 years old. At 10 in the morning, Astrid looked north and saw the wall. Gray, solid, the color of iron, and the texture from this distance of something that had no texture at all, just a uniform opacity stretching from horizon to horizon, moving south faster than weather had any business moving. She stood at the door of the wool house and watched it for perhaps 30 seconds. Then she brought Marin inside and closed the felt flap and began immediately making the wool house ready for what was coming. She moved the remaining firewood inside, stacking it against the curved wall nearest the stove, until the interior smelled of cottonwood and coal bark. She filled every vessel she owned with water from the creek because creek access would be impossible for the duration. She checked every lashing on the exterior with her hands, feeling for looseness, finding none. She fed the stove until it was running at capacity, charging the small space with heat against the cold that was on its way. By noon, the wall was overhead. The sky disappeared. Snow began, not the gentle accumulation of a normal winter storm, but the driven horizontal violence of a genuine blizzard, each flake a projectile moving at speeds that stripped the perception of individual snowflakes and replaced it with a single white roar. Visibility dropped to nothing. She could not see the willow windbreak where her sheep were sheltered. She could not see the creek. She could not see the 4-foot cabin walls her son had built, standing 50 yards away. She checked the thermometer at 1 in the afternoon. 22 below zero. At 4 o'clock, 38 below. By midnight, 46 below zero. The stove consumed wood faster than she had calculated. In moderate cold, a full load burned 4 hours. In this cold, 46 below, with wind driving against the wool house in sustained gusts that she could hear but not feel, the same load lasted 2.5 hours. She was feeding the stove not every 3 to 4 hours, but every 2, and the wood pile stacked against the curved interior wall was declining at a rate that her notebook arithmetic had not prepared her for. She fed the stove through the evening and into the night, rising from the blankets every 2 hours with the automatic precision of a person whose body has been trained to a rhythm and maintains it even through exhaustion. 2 hours, load the stove, check the thermometer. Back to the blankets. 2 hours, load the stove, check the thermometer. The interior temperature held at 58 degrees through the first night, not the 61 of normal operations. The extreme cold outside was pressing harder than anything the wool house had faced. But 58 was warm. 58 was alive. She was monitoring the woodpile the way she monitored everything, with continuous attention and no waste of anxiety. When at 3 in the morning on January the 10th, she reached for Marin's shoulder to check on her and found the child's skin hot under her hand. Not sleep warm, not the warmth of a child buried under blankets in a heated room, the dry, scorching heat of fever. She pressed the back of her hand to Marin's forehead. The skin was tight and hot and wrong. Marin's breathing had the shallow quality that Astrid had heard before in sick children, a labor to it, a rasping at the bottom of each breath that meant the chest was involved. Marin's eyes opened but did not focus. They moved without landing. "Mama," she said. "Not grandmother. Mama." The word of a child calling for someone who was not there. "I'm here," Astrid said. "Little one, I'm here." She said it in Norwegian and in English, both the way she said things that mattered in every language available to her. No doctor within 60 miles. No way to reach Lewistown in these conditions. The horse would die within an hour outside. Cecily Drummond 7 miles east might as well have been in another country. There was nothing beyond these felt walls and this stove, and whatever Astrid carried in her hands and her memory from a lifetime of tending people who needed tending. She boiled water and held the steam near Marin's face, letting the warm vapor rise into the child's airways. Her mother had done this for her once when she was small, a chest illness in a Norwegian winter. She could feel her mother's hands in her own hands as she held the pot. She brewed willow bark tea, stripping bark from the small stores she had kept through the summer. On the memory of her mother's voice saying it was useful for fevers, bitter and effective, a thing that worked because it worked, and not because anyone had given it a scientific accounting. She coaxed Marin to drink small sips, the child compliant, in the boneless way of high fever, her body surrendering its own agency. She pressed cool cloths to Marina's forehead, not cold, not the shock of cold against fever. Heat, but the measured coolness that drew temperature down without alarming the body into driving it higher. Changed them every few minutes as the fever heated them through. And every 2 hours, the stove. The math of it was impossible. The stove needed loading every 2 hours, or the fire would drop to coals and the temperature would begin its fall. And at 46 below zero outside, a dying fire was not a cold house. It was a death sentence. Marin needed attention every hour. Steam for the breathing, tea for the fever, cloths for the cooling, presence, the constant human presence that sick children needed the way they needed water. Astrid did not solve the math. She abolished it. She chose not to sleep, and by choosing not to sleep, she removed the constraint that made the math impossible. 2 hours at the stove, 1 hour with Marin. 2 hours at the stove, 1 hour with Marin. The rhythm became the thing she was, became the entire content of her existence for a span of time that she would later be unable to measure accurately, because she had stopped being a person tracking time and had become instead a person tracking fire and breath. Midday on January the 10th, the second day of the storm. The interior temperature had dropped to 52 degrees. The woodpile against the curved wall was down to what she estimated was 30 hours of fuel. Her hands shook when she lifted the stove lid. Her thoughts came slowly, each one requiring more effort than the last, the way walking requires more effort when the snow is knee-deep. The main woodpile was outside, 30 feet from the door, in a storm that had not paused for breath in 24 hours, was in a temperature that killed unprotected skin in minutes. She thought about this for a moment, not deciding whether to go out. That decision had already been made by the arithmetic of fuel remaining versus fuel needed. Deciding how. She dressed in every layer she owned, pulling clothing over clothing until she moved like a person wrapped in sacking. She found the length of rope she had set aside for exactly this contingency, coiled and hanging near the doorframe. She tied one end around her waist. She tied the other end to the heavy cottonwood post of the doorframe, the sturdiest fixed point in the structure. 30 feet of rope. The woodpile was 30 feet away. She had measured it in October when she thought about this possibility and set the rope length accordingly. She pulled the felt flap aside and stepped out. The cold hit her like a physical blow. Not cold as she had known cold, but something else entirely cold as a material force with weight and intention, pressing against every inch of exposed skin with a deliberateness that made the concept of weather feel inadequate. Her breath froze in her throat on the first inhalation, a sensation like inhaling glass, and she breathed shallowly through her nose and kept moving. She could see nothing. White in every direction, not the white of snow, but the white of a world that had removed all of its information. She could not see the woodpile. She could not see the wool house behind her. She felt the rope in her hands, the only geometry that remained. She moved toward the woodpile by dead reckoning, counting steps. Her arms extended forward until her hands touched the stack. She grabbed wood blindly, tucking logs against her chest, filling her arms with as much as she could carry and still move. She turned back toward the rope. She followed it hand over hand. The wool house appeared from the white at 5 feet. She found the door flap. She pushed through. The warmth inside was the most complete physical sensation she had ever experienced. The contrast was total, a crossing of boundaries so sharp that her body registered it as a kind of violence, the violence of rescue, the body's startled recognition that death had been near and was now not near. She stood inside for a moment, logs against her chest, breathing. Then she went back out. 4 trips, each one the same. The rope, the white, the counting, the woodpile by touch, the rope back, the warmth that hit like a wall. On the 4th trip, she misjudged by 2 steps and went past the door, and her left hand following the wall. Found felt instead of the door frame, and she moved along the curve until the frame was under her fingers, and she pushed through and was inside. She stood with the logs in her arms for a moment without moving. Then she loaded the stove. Then she went back to Marin. The child's breathing had changed while she was gone. She heard it when she knelt beside the pallet before she touched Marin's face. The rasp that had been present in every breath since 3 in the morning was different. Not gone. Loosened. The way a knot loosens when tension has been slowly worked out of it. She pressed her hand to Marin's forehead. The skin was warm, not scorching. Warm in the direction of normal rather than in the direction of danger. She pressed again to be certain. Definitely cooler than 2 hours ago. The fever was not gone, but it was moving the right way down instead of up the body, finding its way back from whatever edge it had approached. She sat on the edge of the pallet and held Marin's hand and did not move for a long time, listening to the improved breathing and the wind outside and the stove crackling with the wood she had brought in through 46 below zero on the end of a rope. At 2 in the morning on January the 11th, Marin's eyes opened. They focused. They found her grandmother's face and held it. "Ba oi," Marin said. "I'm thirsty." Astrid gave her water, then tea, then more water. Marin drank with the urgency of a body that had been burning through fluid for 36 hours and knew what it needed. She drank and rested, and drank again. "Are you hungry?" Astrid asked. Yes, she made biscuits and broth. Marin ate slowly, tiredly, but she ate. By dawn on January the 11th, the fever had broken fully. Marin was asleep again, the deep, genuine sleep of recovery, rather than the restless, unconscious of illness, her breathing even and untroubled and normal. Astrid sat beside her sleeping granddaughter in the dimness of the wool house, and the stove crackled, and the wind outside, after 36 hours of sustained fury, began in small ways to show signs of tiring. She did not cry. She had not cried since Miles City, since Erickson's burial in the spring cold ground, since the moment she had understood that she was going now into whatever came next with a 7-year-old child and $14 and no plan. She sat very still and she breathed, and she felt the warmth of the wool house around her, the felt walls holding 60 degrees while 46 below raged on the other side of an 1.5 inches of compressed wool fiber, the stove ticking, the small sound of Marin breathing in sleep. Outside on the open range that stretched from her creek to the Judith Mountains and beyond, 362,000 cattle were dying. Inside it was warm. She had built this. From willow she had cut herself in wool, she had washed herself, and felt she had pressed herself by dragging it behind an aging draft horse across the rocky ground of a creek bank in Montana. 1 panel at a time, 5 to 6 days per panel, 11 panels, the labor of 4 months of 14-hour days with a 7-year-old child playing nearby in a canvas tent and $14, in the voice of a mother, 30 years dead, who had taught her without knowing it how to save her granddaughter's life on a January night in 1887. She sat with that for a long time. Then she got up and loaded the stove, because the stove always needed loading and the work was always waiting. And she went to the door and pushed the felt flap aside slightly and looked out at the first gray light of January the 11th beginning to show in the east through the diminishing storm, the white prairie slowly revealing its catastrophe in the growing light. The worst was over. She had enough wood for another 2 days. She had food for another week. Marin was sleeping and breathing and had asked for biscuits. What came next she did not yet know. But she had learned something in the past 36 hours that she had not quite known before, not with this completeness. not with this certainty. She knew what she had built. She knew it worked. The storm ended the way it had arrived, all at once. Not gradually, not with the slow loosening that most storms showed as they tired, but completely, the wind dropping from 40 miles an hour to nothing in the space of perhaps 10 minutes on the morning of January the 11th, the silence arriving so suddenly that Astrid heard it as a sound, a kind of negative pressure, the world catching its breath after 36 hours of screaming. She stood at the door of the wool house and listened to the silence for a moment. Then she pulled the felt flap aside and stepped out into it. The cold was still absolute, 44 below zero by her outside thermometer, which she read by crouching close to it. In the still air, the mercury pressed to the bottom of its range. But without the wind, the temperature was a fact rather than a force, something to account for rather than something to fight. And she stood in the stillness of the aftermath and looked at what the storm had made of the world. The prairie was white and absolute in every direction, the drifts smoothed by the last hours of wind into curves that looked sculpted rather than natural, the kind of beauty that is made from catastrophe and does not apologize for its origins. The willow windbreak where her sheep were sheltered was a white mound with a dark interior visible through the gap she had left for access. She could hear the animals inside before she reached them, the particular sounds of sheep that are cold and pressed together and alive. She pushed through the gap and stood in the packed interior and counted. 172. She walked the perimeter of the pen and found the 8 that had not survived their bodies along the outer edge, where the cold had been worse frozen and half covered by the drifted snow that had packed against the willow walls through the night. Less than 5%. She stood beside the bodies for a moment, acknowledging the loss the way you acknowledge losses that are smaller than they could have been, which is with gratitude rather than grief. Then she straightened up and looked out through the gap at the open range beyond the creek. The dark shapes on the white prairie began where her claim ended and continued to the horizon without interruption. She stood looking at them for a long time, trying to count, understanding that counting was not possible at this scale. Cattle, hundreds of them visible from where she stood, frozen where they had stopped moving, dusted with snow. The open-range cattle industry of the Musselshell Valley displayed across the landscape in the only accounting that mattered. She walked back to the wool house. She fed the stove. She checked Marin, who was still sleeping, the sleep of genuine recovery. She made coffee and sat in the center of her floor and drank it and looked at the felt walls that had held 60 degrees while the world outside reached 46 below, and she thought about what came next. Halvard Cross arrived on the 18th of January. She saw him from a distance, a single rider moving up the valley from the south through snow that was still knee-deep on the flat. He was moving slowly, the horse picking its way through the drifts with the careful deliberation of an animal that has learned not to commit its full weight until the ground beneath is known. Cross sat the horse with the particular stillness of a man who is conserving something, warmth or energy or the attention required for careful thought in extreme cold. He had aged since May. This was not the accumulation of months. It was the specific aging that comes from a week of hard work in brutal conditions, from seeing things that use up something that cannot be replaced quickly. The deep lines around his mouth were deeper. The pale eyes were tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. He dismounted at the wool house door and stood for a moment without speaking, looking at the structure the way he had looked at it in October when he had left the stove, reading it the way he read everything with a thoroughness that did not rush. "You're alive," he said. "Yes." "The girl. She had a fever. She is better now." He nodded slowly. He looked at the wool house, at the felt walls that had shed the storm's snow, cleanly, the round roof bare and intact, while everything within sight had been buried or toppled or reshaped beyond recognition. "May I come in?" Astrid held the flap open. He stepped through and straightened up in the interior and stood in the warmth of 64 degrees, still in his coat, still in his hat, and he looked at the thermometer on the inside post, and then he looked at Astrid. "What does it read outside?" he said. 22 below, as of this morning. He closed his eyes. He stood in the center of the wool house with his eyes closed and his arms at his sides, and Astrid watched him and did not speak, because she understood that he was doing something private in the space behind his closed eyes, and it was not her place to interrupt it. When he opened his eyes, they were red at the rims. He walked to the felt wall and pressed his palm flat against it, held it there. The wall was warm under his hand wool, holding the heat of the stove against the 22 below on the other side, doing what Wool had always done quietly and without drama and without requiring anyone's acknowledgement. I buried 3 families this week, Cross said. His voice had the texture of gravel flat and abraded. People who built log cabins and split firewood and did everything that everyone in this valley agreed was the correct way to survive a Montana winter. They did everything right. He paused. Their wood ran out on the 3rd day. The cold came in through the chinking. He took his hand off the felt wall. "And you built this," he said. "And you lived." He looked at Marin, who was sitting up on her pallet watching him with the solemn attention of a child who understands that something important is happening in the room. "I told you that you would freeze," Cross said. "I told you the girl would freeze beside you." Astrid said nothing. "I have buried my wife in this country," he said. "I have buried my daughter. I have spent 11 years understanding what winter takes." He looked at the thermometer again. 86 degrees of difference, inside to outside. In a house made from sheep's wool. He reached into his coat and produced the small notebook he always carried, the one he used for tally counts and weather observations, and the practical arithmetic of running a cattle operation in a valley that required constant accounting. He opened it to a blank page. "Tell me everything," he said. He stayed for 2 hours. He wrote everything she told him, the measurements and the process and the principles as she understood them, his hand moving across the notebook pages with the careful precision of a man who understood that he was recording something that mattered. He asked questions in the methodical way of someone building a complete picture rather than satisfying curiosity, going back to points she had touched on, to press for specifics she had not volunteered. How thick were the felt panels? Each one approximately 3/4 of an inch of compressed fiber. 2 layers on the walls with a small air gap between the outer and inner covering where the lattice structure provided space. Total wall thickness including the lattice frame approximately 1.5 inches. How much wool? 300 pounds of raw fleece to produce the 11 finished panels. Approximately 150 pounds of finished felt after the water and lanolin and loose fiber were pressed out. How long to build? 4 months working alone 14 hours a day. With help and a second person doing felting, while another person built frames, she estimated 2 months. How much firewood through the worst of the storm? She walked to the wood pile and estimated the difference between what she had stacked on January 8th and what remained, now doing the subtraction in her head. Less than 1 cord. Perhaps 40 hours of continuous stoking at the maximum rate the stove required in the worst cold. This last figure stopped him. He looked up from the notebook. 1 cord, he said. "Yes, I burned 3 cords in January," he said. "In my log cabin, with the chinking I put in every fall and the firewood I cut all summer. 3 cords to your one in a house twice the size of this one." He looked around the interior, measuring it with his eyes. "You have less than half the volume," he said, "but even accounting for that, the thermal performances." He stopped, finished the thought in his head rather than out loud. His expression carried the weight of a man doing arithmetic, that is, rearranging something he had believed firmly for a very long time. The round shape, Astrid said. "Smaller volume means less surface area for heat to escape through, and the felt holds warmth close to the interior rather than conducting it outward. Log walls conduct cold inward. It is fast as the stove can push heat in. The wool does not conduct. It holds." Cross wrote for a moment, then he looked up. "I should send this to the Wool Growers Association," he said. "You have built something they need to know about." "It's not mine to keep," Astrid said. "If it helps others survive, they should have it." He nodded. He closed the notebook. He looked at her for a long moment. This man who had ridden 15 miles in 22 below zero to see with his own eyes what he had heard about from a passing rider, this man who had told her in May that she would die, and had spent the intervening 8 months being wrong about it in ways that he was still absorbing. "I was wrong about you," he said finally. He said it simply, no surrounding language to soften or qualify it. The statement standing alone, the way a true statement can stand when there is nothing to add to it. He put his hat back on and ducked through the felt door flap and mounted his horse and rode south through the knee-deep snow toward his own claim, his figure growing small against the white of the valley and then disappearing into the tree line where the mussel shell bent east. Astrid stood at the door and watched him go. Then she went inside and fed the stove and began making lunch for Marin. Cecily Drummond came on the 25th of January. She had lost 18 of her 30 cattle. She had found them in a coulee 2 miles from her cabin, piled together in the hollow, where they had drifted, seeking shelter from the wind, buried by the drifting snow until the hollow was full. She had dug them out with a shovel over 3 days, hoping for survivors. She found none. 12 cattle remaining from 30. She had kept them close to the cabin through the worst of the storm, fed them hay from her depleted supply, done everything that experience and common sense indicated, and still lost more than half. She dismounted outside the wool house and stood looking at it with her arms crossed over her coat, her expression doing the careful work of a woman who has been wrong about something and is deciding how to be wrong about it correctly. She walked around the structure, once pressing her hand against the felt wall at several points, feeling the density of it, the slight give of the willow lattice underneath the warmth that was present in the outer layer, even in January cold. She looked at the round roof, at the overlapping panels that had shed the storm's snow without collecting it. She looked at the smoke hole in the crown, the small column of pale smoke rising straight up in the still air, and she looked at the thermometer nailed to the outside post. 12 below zero. She knocked on the door frame post. Astrid held the flap open. Cecily stepped inside and stopped immediately. The warmth of the interior stopped her the way it stopped everyone who came through the door. For the first time, the absolute physical contrast between what the world outside was offering and what the wool house held against it. She did not say anything for a moment. She walked to the inside thermometer and read it. 62 degrees. She walked to the stove and held out her hands. She looked at the felt walls from the inside where the lantern light caught the texture of the compressed fiber, thousands of small surfaces catching and reflecting the light in a way that log walls never did. "I told you, fabric walls couldn't hold heat like logs," she said. "I remember." Cecily was quiet. She looked at Marin, who was sitting near the stove, working on a piece of felt with a small iron rod boring holes at measured intervals. Her small hands moving with the efficiency of a child who has learned a skill to the point of confidence. "The child is learning the process," Cecily said. "She learns everything I do," Astrid said. "She has from the beginning." Cecily watched Marin work for a moment. Something in her face shifted, the particular expression of a practical woman, recognizing that the thing she dismissed as impossible has produced a child who treats it as ordinary, which is the deepest form of evidence. "I was wrong, Ingrid," she said. She used the wrong name and did not notice, and Astrid did not correct her because the meaning of the sentence was exact regardless of what name it was attached to. "I'm glad I was wrong." She reached into her coat and produced a burlap sack. Inside were 3 laying hens, thin from the storm, but alive and functional, their small, affronted faces visible through the top of the sack. "They're laying," Cecily said. "Not much, but something. You'll have fresh eggs through the rest of winter." Astrid took the sack. "I don't know how you did it," Cecily said. "The felting alone. The framework alone, while you're 4 months alone with the child." She looked around the interior one more time, memorizing it the way a builder memorizes a structure that has done something the builder did not believe was possible. "But you did it, and I'm glad you're alive." She went back out into the cold and mounted her horse and rode east toward her diminished herd and her leaking cabin roof and the life that had made sense and still made sense in its way, just differently than it had before January the 9th. Astrid stood at the door and watched her go. Then she put the hens in the small pen she had built against the south wall of the wool house and went back inside to where Marin was still working on her felt piece, the iron rod moving steadily hole by hole. Declan Marr did not come. The news of him filtered through the valley in the weeks after the storm, carried by riders and freighters in the slow information network of a frontier community processing a collective catastrophe. He had lost 1,400 cattle in the storm, slightly under half his herd. The surviving animals were in poor condition, thin and weakened, requiring hay that he had not laid in sufficient quantities because 25 years of open-range operation had never required it before. He sold the survivors in March at prices that reflected the territory's sudden oversupply of distressed cattle and the equally sudden collapse of buyer confidence in an industry that had just demonstrated its fundamental fragility. He sold his range rights in April to a consortium of buyers who were already calculating how many sheep the Musselshell Valley could carry and what wool prices were likely to do in the next decade. He left Montana Territory in April on the eastbound train from Lewistown. He took what he could carry and left what he could not, and he did not come back. The land absorbed his absence, the way land absorbs all absences, without ceremony, filling the space with whatever came next. What came next in the Muscle Shell Valley was sheep. Josue Lorza rode up from Miles City in late April when the snow had pulled back from the south-facing slopes and the first green was showing in the creek bottom, and the air had the particular quality of a Montana spring, which is the quality of something that has been through the worst and is deciding whether to forgive it. He was 49 years old, a Basque shepherd who worked for a large sheep outfit and spent most of his year alone on the range with his flock and his dogs. His people had worked with sheep for generations beyond counting in the mountains of a region between France and Spain, where the relationship between a shepherd and his flock was not a profession, but a calling carried in the blood. He had heard about the wool house from a freighter who had heard about it from Halvard Cross, who had sent his notes to the Wool Growers Association in February and received in return a letter asking for more details in the name of the woman who had built it. Elorza dismounted and stood looking at the wool house the way a man looks at something that interests him professionally, the evaluative attention of a person who knows a great deal about the subject in question and is comparing what he sees to what he knows. He walked around it once. He pressed his hand against the felt wall in 3 places, feeling the density and the consistency. He looked at the crown ring visible through the smoke hole, the junction where the 48 roof poles converged the lashings that had held through Montana's worst winter in decades. He touched the door frame and examined the way the felt panel met the structural, post the overlap, and the lashing, and he nodded slowly in the way of someone recognizing a solution that he understands because he has thought about the same problem from a different direction. Astrid came out, and they stood together in the April morning. "In my country," he said. His English was careful, built from long practice rather than early immersion, each word chosen rather than assumed. "In the Basque Mountains, we have what we call a tsubola, a small house for shepherds for the high summer pastures. Stone walls, low roof, built for one man and his flock against the mountain weather." He looked at the wool house. "We never thought to use felt for the walls," he said. "Always stone, always timber." He shook his head slowly. "We have the wool. We have always had the wool. We have been making felt for longer than anyone can say, but we never thought to build with it." Astrid said nothing. She let him look. "You built this because you had nothing else," he said, "not as a judgment, as a recognition." "Yes." He looked at Marin, who had come out and was standing near the door watching him with the direct attention she applied to new adults until she had decided what they were. "The child knows how to make felt," he said. He had watched Marin at work through the open door while Astrid was checking the sheep pen. "She learned before she learned to read," Astrid said. Elorza looked at Marin for a long moment. "Then that is what you built," he said. His voice had the quality of someone arriving at a conclusion that the evidence had been pointing toward for some time. "Not the house, the knowing. That is what will last." He looked back at the wool house. "I will copy everything," he said. "Every measurement, every technique. I will take it to the other Basque herders in this territory. They have flocks. They have wool. Some of them have nothing else." He paused. "They need to know this is possible." "Take everything you need," Astrid said. He spent 3 days. He walked every dimension and wrote every number and watched Astrid demonstrate the felting process from the beginning, from the laying of the raw fiber to the rolling and the dragging and the final compression that produced the finished panel. He filled a notebook with sketches and measurements and process notes in a language she could not read, and he took a small sample of finished felt, a piece the size of his palm, and put it in his coat pocket. When he was done, he stood at the door of the wool house and shook Astrid's hand, which was not a common gesture between a man and a woman in this country, in this era, in which he offered with the straightforwardness of someone whose culture had not installed the same prohibition. "In my country," he said, "we have a word, Gordetselea. It means the one who keeps, the one who holds something important and makes sure it does not disappear." He looked at her. "You are that," he said, "for this knowledge." He mounted his horse and rode south toward Miles City and disappeared into the spring landscape of the Muscle Shell Valley. Astrid stood at the door of the wool house for a moment. Then she went inside to start the afternoon's work. Spring moved through the valley with the methodical thoroughness that Montana spring showed after hard winters, burning off the snow from south slopes first, and then from the flats, and finally from the north-facing draws, where it lingered longest, unwilling to concede. The cattle carcasses emerged as the snow retreated, revealed in the melt, the way objects are revealed when a tide pulls back, lying where they had fallen across the open range in numbers that made the winter's accounting concrete in a way that no spoken figure could match. 362,000 head across the territory. The cowboys who had mocked sheep operations as women's work were riding east on trains by April, or staying to rebuild with different arithmetic. The wool market, which had been steady before the winter, strengthened as the cattle market collapsed. Ranchers who had spent 2 decades controlling range through intimidation and sheer animal mass found themselves calculating what their depleted ranges could carry in sheep and whether the Wool Growers Association would extend them credit on breeding stock. Some of them bought breeding ewes from Astrid Valen at prices that would have seemed absurd 12 months earlier, and she sold what she could spare at fair market price and kept what she needed for the expansion she was already planning. 4 wool houses went up in Fergus County by the summer of 1887. Not many, not a movement, but 4 families, widows and immigrants, and people who had sheep and wool and not much else, who had heard about the structure on the mussel shell and had come to look at it and had left with sketches and the knowledge of how it was done. Astrid taught them all. She held nothing back, the way her mother had held nothing back about wool processing, the way knowledge passes in communities that understand that what you share does not diminish what you have. She walked claim boundaries with them and helped them find the willow stands. She demonstrated the lattice weaving on her own frame. She showed them the felting process from the raw fiber forward, not describing it, but doing it, because some knowledge lives in hands rather than in words and must be transferred the same way. "Why are you sharing this?" one of the women asked. Her name was Helga, and she had come from a failing claim near Judith Gap with 3 children and 200 pounds of unsold wool, and the specific desperation of a person who has calculated her options and found them insufficient. "My son died trying to build something on this claim," Astrid said. "He wanted the future that this land could provide. I cannot give that back to him, but I can make sure what I learned here does not die with me." Helga looked at the wool house, at the round walls and the crown ring, and the soft felt that had held 60 degrees while 46 below tried to take everything. She started building the following week. The wool house became the lambing shelter. This happened gradually in the practical way that things on a working claim evolve from what they are toward what is needed from them. By the spring of 1888, Astrid had begun the construction of a more permanent structure, a proper house with a log frame and a shingled roof, and glass windows that faced south and caught the light she had missed through 2 winters in the round felt darkness. The wool house did not come down. It had a use it was uniquely suited for, and Astrid was not a person who dismantled what worked simply because something better had arrived to supplement it. She moved the stove to the new house. She replaced the felt floor covering with clean straw and let the sheep in. Newborn lambs, which came in March and early April when the Montana nights were still capable of killing unprotected young animals, were carried from the outdoor pen to the wool house, where the felt walls held warmth enough to keep a lamb alive through the critical first hours. The structure that had saved a woman and a child in the worst winter anyone could remember became the place where new life began, where small creatures took their first breaths in the warmth that Astrid's hands had built from willow and wool, and the voice of a mother 30 years dead and an ocean away. She thought about this sometimes, the continuity of it, her mother teaching her hands in Norway, those hands building something in Montana. The thing those hands built sheltering the beginnings of new lives. She did not think it was poetic. She thought it was practical, the way useful knowledge was practical, passing from person to person and from use to use without losing its value, accumulating rather than diminishing through the passage. Maren grew up knowing how to build, not knowing about building, not having watched it done, knowing it in her hands in the specific muscular memory of the felting process and the lattice weaving, and the way rawhide behaved when wet and when dry, and what tension was correct for each application. She could bore holes in willow laths at 9-inch intervals with a heated iron rod and produce results indistinguishable from the panels Astrid had built alone in the summer of 1886. She learned to read in the winter of 1887 from a book that Cecily Drummond brought from Lewistown, sitting in the warmth of the new log house, with the lamp turned up and the Montana winter doing what it did outside the glass windows. She learned with the focused efficiency she applied to everything she had decided mattered, which was everything her grandmother considered worth teaching. By the time she was 10, Marin could build a wool house from the beginning. She had done it twice smaller versions, practiced structures that she built and disassembled and rebuilt, improving each time, her understanding of the principles deepening through repetition into the kind of knowledge that could not be lost without effort. Astrid watched her work and felt something she had difficulty naming. Not pride exactly, though pride was part of it. Something more like relief. The relief of a person who has been carrying something important alone for a long time and has found someone to carry it alongside her. You build the same way your great-grandmother built, felt, Astrid told her once. Marin looked up from the lattice she was weaving. Your great-grandmother in Norway. I watched her hands when I was your age, and I did not know I was learning. She was teaching me the way you learn best, by letting you do it beside her. Marin looked at her own hands, at the willow lath in one and the rawhide strip in the other. Is that how you teach me? She said. Yes. Marin nodded. She went back to weaving. After a moment, she said without looking up, then I'll teach my children the same way. The final accounting of the winter of 1886 to 1887 took years to complete because the losses were distributed across a territory so large that gathering and totaling them required the kind of systematic effort that frontier record-keeping was not always equal to. But the number that emerged, 362,000 cattle dead across Montana Territory, represented more than an agricultural catastrophe. It represented the end of a way of thinking about the land and what it could be asked to bear without consequence. The open range era, the swagger and the borrowed grass and the arithmetic of maximum extraction with minimum investment ended in the winter of 1886 to 1887. What replaced it was different in its assumptions, more modest in its claims, more attentive to what the land actually offered rather than what men with borrowed money had decided to demand from it. Sheep were part of what replaced it, not because they were better animals in some abstract sense, but because they had survived what the cattle had not, because the wool they produced was a sustainable return on the land's actual carrying capacity, because the women and immigrants who ran them had built their operations on smaller margins and more careful calculation, and had not assumed that the good years would continue indefinitely, simply because they had continued so far. Halvard Cross sold his cattle in the summer of 1887 and bought 300 sheep. He did this without fanfare and without explaining himself to anyone who asked which was the Cross way of doing things that he had decided and did not wish to relitigate. He built a wool house on his claim that summer, working from the notes he had taken in Astrid's kitchen in January, and he used it for lambing and for the occasional winter emergency, and as a testament to something he did not put into words, but that was present in the care he took with the construction. He visited the Vollen claim twice a year after that, spring and fall regular as the seasons. He never explained the visits, and Astrid never asked for an explanation. He would arrive, assess whatever was in progress, offer labor, where it was useful, drink coffee at the new kitchen table, and ride home. He watched Marin grow from 8 to 12 to 16, watched her competence accumulate the way he watched weather patterns accumulate, with the recognition of someone who understood that what was building would eventually arrive as something significant. The year Marin turned 15, he said to Astrid, "She knows more about this than you did when you built it. She has the advantage of learning from someone who made all the mistakes first," Astrid said. Cross nodded. He looked at the wool house still standing after 8 years, the felt weathered now to a gray that was not beautiful exactly, but was the color of something that had survived many things and was still present. "My wife would have liked her," he said. He said it the way he said the things he said about Sigrid, simply and without surrounding language, as a fact that stood alone. Astrid looked at Marin, who was working across the yard with the confidence of someone doing a familiar thing in good conditions. "Yes," she said, "I think she would have." What endured was not the wool house itself, though the wool house endured for 20 years, serving as lambing shelter and storm refuge, and the occasional home for a new hand who needed a place to sleep while a more permanent arrangement was made. What endured was Marin's hands, and the hands she taught in turn, the children who grew up on the Vollen claim and on the claims of the families who had learned from Astrid in the spring and summer of 1887, the children who learned felting before they learned reading, and who carried the knowledge into the next generation with the unremarkable ease of people for whom the knowledge is simply part of what is known. The technique did not become famous. It did not spread through the territory the way certain innovations spread quickly and completely, referenced in newspapers and agricultural bulletins. It spread the way most useful knowledge spread on the frontier, person to person, demonstrated rather than explained, copied into notebooks that were carried in coat pockets and consulted in barns in January, adapted to local conditions and available materials by people who understood the principles well enough to modify the application. Josu Ilorza built 6 wool houses across the territory in the 5 years after his visit to the Mussel Shell, teaching Basque herders who recognized in the structure something adjacent to what their own tradition had produced in the mountains of their homeland. A convergence of solutions arrived at from different starting points toward the same answer, the way all answers to genuine problems eventually converge when enough people are cold enough for long enough and paying close enough attention. Halvard Cross's letter to the Wool Growers Association was published in their quarterly bulletin in the spring of 1887, with a diagram of the crown ring construction and a table comparing fuel consumption between the wool house and a log cabin of similar interior volume across 3 temperature ranges. The table was the most persuasive element of the document, as tables usually are, because numbers require no persuasion of their own and carry none of the freight of personality or argument. The bulletin was read by people it was not meant for, as useful information usually is, and copies of the relevant pages were sent to other people, and in this way the knowledge moved beyond the Musselshell Valley into other parts of Montana and into Idaho and Wyoming and the eastern reaches of Washington Territory, where sheep operations were expanding into land that the cattle industry had vacated in the aftermath of the Great Die-Up. Astrid Valen never knew the full extent of this. She knew what she could see, which was 4 wool houses in Fergus County by the end of 1887 and 11 by 1890, in the slow but unmistakable shift in how the valley thought about winter preparation and the materials available for it. She knew that people came to her, claimed to learn, and that she taught them, and that they left with something they had not arrived with. She did not think of it as a legacy. She thought of it as work that needed doing. On a morning in September of 1888, Astrid stood at the door of the wool house and looked out at the valley settling into the particular amber light of a Montana autumn, the cottonwoods along the creek beginning to turn the grass cured to a pale gold, the mountains to the north already wearing their first thin snow on the upper ridges. Maren was across the yard teaching Helga's daughter, who was 10, how to bore holes in willow laths at 9-inch intervals. She was demonstrating and then stepping back and letting the girl try, then demonstrating again with the small corrections of a patient teacher who understands that the correction must happen in the hands rather than in the explanation. Astrid watched her granddaughter teach the way her mother had taught her, by doing it alongside, by letting the learning happen through the hands rather than through the ears. She thought about the June afternoon on the creek bank, the wet fleece warm around her shoulders in an unseasonable wind. Her mother's voice arriving across 30 years in an ocean with something she had heard 1,000 times and finally at 62 actually heard. Wool holds heat even when wet. That is why lambs survive in spring rain that kills calves. She had built a house from that sentence. She had survived a winter that killed 362,000 cattle from that sentence. She had made it possible for Maren to teach a 10-year-old girl to bore holes in willow laths from that sentence. Her mother had said it without knowing what it would one day build. She had said it the way you say things that are simply true because they are simply true into the air of an ordinary morning in Norway in front of a daughter who was not yet listening. And across 30 years in an ocean, the daughter had finally listened. That was what had built the wool house. Not the willow, not the wool, not the 4 months of 14-hour days, or the 576 holes, or the dragging and the pressing and the 46 below rope. All of those had been necessary. But underneath all of them was a sentence a woman had said to a girl in Norway in an ordinary morning, and not knowing it would matter, not knowing it would cross the Atlantic and survive 2 deaths and reach a Montana creek bank in the exact moment when someone was cold enough and desperate enough and quiet enough to hear it. The knowledge had passed. The hands had done their work. The walls had held. Halvard Cross had been wrong. He had been glad to be wrong. And somewhere in the mountains of a Basque country that Astrid Valen would never see a shepherd was building a Tixabola with felt walls, and in the spring it would shelter lambs, that would not have survived in stone. And the shepherd would teach his children the method the way his father had not taught it because his father had not known it. And the children would teach their children, and the knowledge would move forward through time in the way that knowledge moves when it has found its way into hands that understand it. Forward, without end. The way warmth moves through wool, slowly and completely filling every small space, yielding nothing back to the cold.